following preview was begrudgingly approved for all audiences.
You're listening to Elevator Music.
Welcome to Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League. I'm Ricky Vellante, and I'll be joined by my co-host David West shortly. As usual, we will be welcoming guests, challenging the status quo, doing social good, and bringing about positive change to the world, while also talking a little bit of sports. In this episode, we are joined by two guests. First, legal expert and professor at American University Washington College of Law, Jeremi Duru, to discuss his work with the Fritz Pollard Alliance and the creation and evolution of the Rooney Rule. Then we'll be joined by senior writer from ESPN's The Undefeated and co-writer of I Came as a Shadow, John Thompson's autobiography, Jesse Washington. With Jesse, we'll be discussing the book, what it was like to work with Coach Thompson, and some of his takes on the current landscape of collegiate and professional sports. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe Forward Thinking on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL's YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. We hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host David West. With us today, another special guest, we have Professor Jeremi Duru. Jeremi is the co-author of the 5th edition of Sports Law and Regulation Cases and Materials from Walters and Kluwer. He is also a professor at American University Washington College of Law, and also is an accomplished attorney, primarily the employment space, focused on issues related to sports, and has worked with the Fritz Pollard Alliance and also issues in the NFL and NBA as well. So, Jeremi, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, guys, for having me. Happy to be here.
So I just did like the high level introduction, but now take us through in a little bit more detail about your background and what you're up to these days.
Sure. So yeah, I'm an employment discrimination lawyer, and I'd say more broadly a civil rights lawyer at heart. It's always what I wanted to do coming out of law school. And it just so happened that while I was doing that sort of work, the firm where I was, this is now 17, 18 years ago, was approached by some coaches in the NFL who were concerned about equal opportunity in the league because of race. And I started working on that matter and realized that I could combine my love of sports with my passion for civil rights. And so I've been doing that sort of work since then. I write about it, books and articles. I teach about it. I speak about it. I think that sport has an extraordinary ability to push societies in progressive directions with respect to many things, among them race. So that's the work I do. I love it.
Awesome. Take us a little bit through the work that you've done with the Fritz Pollard Alliance, and also more specifically within the NFL and the NBA on the player side.
Sure. So with respect to the Fritz Pollard Alliance, the work has been mostly on the coaches' side, coaches and executives. I've represented the organization from essentially its development back in 2003, going forward for 17 years, with respect to a number of things, with respect to helping to guide the alliance, the ways in which it has inter-organizational mentoring. So some of the more senior coaches and executives mentoring the more junior ones, preparing them for opportunities at the top of organization hierarchical charts. I've worked pretty closely with the Rooney Rule, advocating for it and exploring its enforcement. The Rooney Rule, maybe some will talk about more. I think its foundation is a strong one, but it's not always been terribly effective, and that's been a disappointment. And I've done some work with representing student athletes who have sued their universities, arguing that the university fraudulently induced them to come to the school, claiming they'd be able to pursue what they want academically, but really just forcing them into nonsense courses so that they'll stay eligible and not really giving them an education. So I've done a fair bit of work with respect to race, but also just with respect to the extent to which sport has, in some ways, under-resourced and dispossessed people, trying to figure out how to make sport a net positive rather than a net negative in society.
I'll ask a quick question, and I like to always figure out sort of reasons why. So what was your reasoning to get into law in the first place? What went into that decision?
So it's interesting. It's interesting you asked that. When I was in the 8th grade, my older brother was talking about Malcolm X. I can't remember the context. And I asked who Malcolm X was. And he made fun of me, basically called me an idiot. Said, how can I now know who Malcolm X is? I'm not going to tell you Malcolm X is. So I had to go and go to the library and figure out who Malcolm X was. And this is somebody, I'm in the 8th grade now, so I'm not a man, but I'm not a little kid either. I'm old enough to have known a little bit about the civil rights struggle in this country. And I learned so much just learning about Malcolm X. And then I basically made it my own goal to study civil rights more broadly, things that I wasn't taught in school. And I just became infatuated with it. And I recognized the efforts, the sacrifices that so many have made to get us to a point where there is, at least as a matter of law, some level of equity in this country. It's been made all the more painful to see what's happened over the last few years, of course, and what's going on currently. But that's what kind of catalyzed me, David. And since then, it's what I've wanted to do, and I feel very fortunate to be able to do what it is that I wanted to do back when I was 13 years old. Now that I'm a working professional.
That's great. Yeah, and you're also to mention you went to Brown, double Harvard grad. I think you may be our first double Harvard grad on the show. There's certainly, I don't think we've had another one. And so coming out of law school in particular, what were some of the first opportunities that you had within law? I know obviously there are few attorneys that get the opportunity to jump straight into sports right out of law school. So what were some of the building blocks that you had in those early experiences?
Yeah, so coming out of law school, I had the extraordinary fortune to clerk for a judge named Damon J. Keith. It's not always the case, but some law students are able to clerk for a judge, which basically means work for the judge. A judge has 2 or 3 clerks to help them think through different issues and help them construct the approach to opinions that they'll be writing. And my judge was a civil rights judge. He'd been a civil rights lawyer before that. He was appointed to the bench in the late 1970s by Jimmy Carter, and actually served on the federal bench, first as a district court judge and then as appellate judge, all the way up until his passing just quite recently in his mid-90s. And he studied under Thurgood Marshall, Howard Law School, Charles Hamilton Houston. These were the folks who cultivated the civil rights passion in him. And so to be able to go and work for him was one of the highlights of my career. It was just extraordinary. And he ensured that I would be committed going forward to these ideals. And I have been. So I left his clerkship after 1 year. I was out in Detroit, had a great time there and with him. And I went to a big law firm from there. I didn't want to really, but frankly, I was broke and I had big debt from law school and I had no, economically, I was quite a squeeze. And so I did that for a couple of years. Lived like a total Spartan for a couple of years and just paid my debt down such that I could do what I wanted to do a couple of years later. That's when I went to the civil rights firm and started following my passion. And then it was just fortuitous that the firm started doing the NFL coaching work. And as I said, once I found that work, I knew what it was I wanted to do in my career.
And how important, I mean, and you've already touched on it a little bit, but how important is sort of racial justice in the sporting arena, seeing as how, like you framed it before, that sports can be a great catalyst toward progress in general society?
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, it's critical, David. For the great deal, the great majority of the 20th century, to be black in sport was to labor, and for the bulk of that time, the wages paid for the laborers were minimal. And so it was just, black population was at the bottom of this pyramid, doing a lot of work, not making a lot of money playing sport, and in some sports enduring quite substantial physical damage, while very few people at the top of the pyramid were the owners of the organizations and making money off of it.
Right.
And so, there was there's no way to get around it. There was subjugation, racial subjugation in sport. And we still see tremendous disproportionality with respect to ownership, presidencies, and on the other hand, players, particularly in the NBA and the NFL. That's where it's most stark because the player populations there, are the blackest, for lack of a better way to put it. It's almost a classic story of black people being sought out and used for their brawn and not appreciated as much for their brain. And so it's a perfect environment in which to push this message that there's got to be opportunity for these people who have toiled in the game to get the just desserts from the game, to benefit from the game in the same way that disproportionately whites have been able to benefit from it.
And so obviously we just had, as of last night, we had the last opening filled within the NFL coaching circles. Before we get into the present day, take us through that initial iteration of the Rooney Rule, what you all were trying to address, and why you felt like that would be an effective way to attempt to start to balance the scales a little bit within the coaching ranks of the NFL.
Sure. And if I can go back historically a little bit, it'll kind of set the stage for what's going on there at the beginning of this century. So back in the 1920s, when, this country was in the depths of racial oppression, you got World War I ending and black servicemen coming back and being killed in the streets for wearing their uniforms. It was just a brutal time. Somehow in that time period, Fritz Pollard became the first head coach of an NFL team. And but some years later, all blacks, coaches, players, there weren't very many of them, but those who were there were expurgated from the league by quote unquote gentleman's agreement, right? Then at the middle of the century, in 1946, blacks began to start to filter back into the league. And over the course of the following decades, their numbers rose and rose. But it wasn't until 1989 that we had another black head coach of color. So we're talking about the bulk of a century in the NFL without a head coach of color, a black head coach. And it was Art Shell in 1989. And then he did very well, if you all remember, with the Los Angeles Raiders. And people thought maybe this was kind of the thin edge of the wedge, that this would open up the gates for other black head coaches, but it really didn't. Over the course of the next 10 years, you might go up to 2 head coaches of color, 3 at the most, and then back to 1. There just wasn't much progress. And when we got to 2001, you had Tony Dungy and you had Dennis Green, 2 of the 3 head coaches in the league, were fired within 2 weeks of each other after that season. Dungy by the Bucks and Dennis Green by the Vikings. And it was now we're down to back to 1 head coach of color in the league out of 32. And it was just too much. So a couple of lawyers got together. They commissioned a study from the University of Pennsylvania, asking the labor economists at the University of Pennsylvania to study win-loss records of head coaches in the NFL by race going back 15 years to 1986. And the results were extraordinary. In the first year of head coaching, black head coaches won 2.7 more games than white head coaches. And then remember, we're talking about a 16-game season now. So that's a lot of games, right, in a 16-game season. Then in the year in which they were terminated, black coaches won almost 1.5 more games than white coaches. They took their teams to the playoffs more often. I mean, the statistics just show that this is a last hired, first fired story for black coaches. So the question was, what happens? What do we do? And for a bunch of reasons, it just didn't seem as though litigation was going to be successful. While the lawyers made a litigation threat, I don't think they really thought it would be successful for a bunch of reasons we can talk about, or maybe they're too far down the rabbit hole for this conversation. But the threat was enough to get the NFL to the negotiating table, so to speak, to talk about what needs to be done. To the credit of Paul Tagliabue, the commissioner at the time, he recognized they had a problem. And so after negotiations for a few months, this idea of every club interviewing 1 person of color for every head coach opening kind of rose to the fore, and all 32 clubs agreed to it, and it came to be known as the Rooney Rule.
Wow.
Yeah. And initially, how did you all see the Rooney Rule sort of being manipulated? Because I know it's come under much criticism, especially in its original iteration. But what were some of the ways that NFL teams were able to successfully manipulate that rule and not actually advance hirings of persons of color?
Sure. Yeah, so the first example came right after the rule was passed. I'm talking about within a month of the rule being effectuated. The Dallas Cowboys were looking for a new head coach. Dave Campo was the head coach. He had a couple 5-11 seasons. They fired him. They were looking for a new head coach, and it was clear they had their eyes on Bill Parcells. By any estimate, an excellent coach, Hall of Fame coach, right? We acknowledge that. But the interview process involved the Cowboys flying to New Jersey to interview Bill Parcells on 2 occasions over the course of 11 hours, and calling Dennis Green on the telephone for 20 to 30 minutes, and then hiring Bill Parcells. So did they interview a candidate of color? Well, yeah, for 20 minutes on the telephone versus 11 hours for the candidate who's not of color. So they fulfilled the text of the rule, but badly flouted the spirit of the rule. So that was the first exploration of how the rule could be undercut. The league then strengthened the rule to say that the interview of the person of color has to be meaningful, meaning that it's got to be similarly situated with respect to the interview of the white candidate. So if what I just described were to happen today, would be deemed a violation of the Rooney Rule. But so there's that. There have been situations where a club has interviewed an internal candidate, somebody already on their staff, and the rumor, nobody knows for sure, but the rumor is that in some of those situations the club even said, signaled to the person on the staff, hey, look, we're not really ready. You're not really ready for a coach opportunity, but just hang in there with us. Take this interview. We have to do this interview, and maybe down the line there'll be an opportunity for you. So that's obviously a manipulation and very unfair. And then just offering the sham interview. You know who you want to hire, and then you bring in a candidate of color to fulfill the Rooney Rule, and then you hire who you want to hire. And not only does that violate the Rooney Rule and spit in the face of those who are seeking to increase equal opportunity in the league, but it's not good for the club either, because the question should not be, who do you want to be the head coach? Everybody can answer that question. The question should be, who would be best for the job? And to answer that question, you actually have to cast a wide net and interview a bunch of folks. And if you don't do that, I posit that you are putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage. So I think it's irrational not to cast a wide net, including candidates of color.
And I would just say, in other leagues, the NBA currently has maybe 4 or 5 black head coaches. WNBA, which is seen as the beacon of progress in professional leagues, they just hired their first black female head coach a few months ago. So do you think that, and then, personally, I think, like you just mentioned, the Rooney Rule, I think these NFL teams more so just go through the exercise to be going through the exercise, and they're not really or truly considering, these black coaching candidates. But as far as the other leagues are concerned, do you think a more wide-ranging sort of general rule like the Rooney Rule needs to be implemented in these other sports as well? Because it's becoming more of an issue in the NBA, and as the players become more vocal and they become more organized in terms of their collective power, I do know behind the scenes they're making demands that more black executives be hired, more black head coaches be hired. So do you think it's something that the sports world in general needs to implement, a more inclusive, more wide-ranging, opportunities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, I think so. As I said at the start, I think the Rooney Rule is a great concept when you're dealing with rational actors, when you're dealing with people who are serious about looking for the best person. And so I think the Rooney Rule should be implemented in other contexts, and it certainly can't hurt. Right. But then in other contexts and in the NFL, there are 2 things. One, we've got to find some way to convince the owners of these clubs that it's in their interest to think broadly about who they want to hire, not just latch on to somebody who they met at a cocktail party, who they heard is the hot candidate. We've got to figure out a way to get interest convergence. That's one. And I think if we were to expand the rule to the NBA, WNBA, that would still be something that would have to be done for the rule to be maximally effective. But in addition to that, I think one thing that's been unfortunate for the NFL is I think early on the Rooney Rule did see some substantial success, and we saw the numbers really go up when it was a novel rule early in its existence. And I think the NFL might have sat back on its laurels a little bit and not been focused on other creative initiatives to work toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. So even if the Rooney Rule were to be adopted in these other sports contexts, I think it would be important to think about other initiatives. Just let the Rooney Rule be one arrow in our quiver. Let there be many initiatives. And one of them, David, you hit on, which is just so critical, is player activism. Unlike the early 1900s I described earlier, where players had zero power, economic or otherwise, players now have some power.
Right.
Particularly the stars, particularly those who have made enough money that they could not give a hoot about making one more cent, and they're fine for generations. They've got an extraordinary amount of power. And as you point out, some in the back are back channeling messages to clubs that you've got to be more diverse in your hiring in the front office and in head coaching. And I think that's a perfect approach. It doesn't have to be out in everybody's face. If they are able to have those conversations and it moves the needle, I think that's fantastic. But without question, if players stood up and said, we're not moving forward if we don't have a strategic approach to increasing diversity in the front offices and the coaching staffs of professional sports, if we saw that, we would see substantial change in my view.
Now, before jumping into, because obviously what we've had happen with the Houston Texans and Deshaun Watson in the last couple of weeks is maybe the other side of the table of what you just described in terms of player empowerment. Before we get into that, though, the Rooney Rule has had certain expansions. It's been expanded to include front office positions, coordinator positions. It now includes female candidates as well. And now the NFL had to get so aggressive with attempting to enforce the Rooney Rule that they are rewarding teams with draft picks for developing candidates of color that are ultimately hired. Again, last night we saw this for the first time. The Baltimore Ravens, I believe, are going to receive 2 third-round draft picks as a result of Cully being hired by the Texans. So in the course of all that, what has been the role of the Fritz Pollard Alliance? And also, what's your perspective on these expansions of the rule? And, what's your thinking around the rule when, as we sit here today, we're back to only 4 coaches of color out of 32 in the NFL?
Yeah, I think the expansions to the rule that you mentioned are important. One that you mentioned, I just wanted to highlight. I think is a critically important one. Is the one you mentioned that also regards gender. So on the business side of an organization, from president on down, among the senior executives, you have to interview a person of color and a woman, which I think is critical because on the business, we've always had more people of color on the operations side than on the business side. And so I think it'll jumpstart things there. But 2, sports has been deemed the male bastion for far too long. David made the point earlier about the WNBA's ascent. And it just, there's no reason why women shouldn't have as much of an opportunity to have a place in sport as men. So I think that was a really important development. But I think, you also talked about the draft picks thing. So I think, so as I said earlier, important to have many arrows in the quiver. Even with the expanded Rooney Rule, we need more initiatives. And this is such an initiative. I think by any estimate, it's a creative initiative. I credit the NFL for recognizing that the needle has not been moving, and so something had to happen. And when progress is being delayed, in my view, there are very few ideas that should be off the table. So I credit the NFL with coming forward with the rule. I think a fair number of assistants in the league aren't thrilled about it. They feel that it is stigmatizing in a way that they need, that they need such a crutch that they need this rule that a club will receive draft picks for them to really be considered. So anytime you have the people who a rule is designed to benefit not happy with the rule, then we have to think about it. So I think the jury is out on the rule. We'll see how it's received, as you point out, once next year's draft comes to pass and you start to see these picks getting picked up, see how people react to it. But I don't fault the league for trying to come up with other initiatives because, it's an ugly situation and it needs attention. And they're attempting to attend to it with this draft pick proposal. We'll see how it plays out.
And now circling back to the Deshaun Watson part, obviously delicate, don't want to put you in a spot where you're saying anything you don't want to say, but at the same time, how crazy is it when we all know that the success of an NFL organization starts and ends with your quarterback position, that you have an organization with such a premier talent that just for whatever you've seen stories about either they weren't listening, they told fibs, whatever the case might be. How crazy is it to see what happened with the Texans throughout this offseason, to the point that now this morning Deshaun Watson has demanded a trade away from the organization?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. I mean, all of us, follow football. Just a couple of years ago, it looked like the Texans were on the verge of something extraordinary. And Deshaun Watson was the face of that, along with J.J. Watt. And Watson has now become a face of the organization more than J.J. Watt. He is an extraordinary talent, as you point out. I don't know him. You guys may, but from all assessments, he seems to be just a great person, community-minded, great teammate, great leader. And so to allow somebody like that to get away is pretty mind-boggling. And it's not just that the club didn't consult him with respect to moves they were making, but according to Deshaun, they promised they would consult him, and then they didn't consult him. So it's a whole nother level. And he's been there thick and thin with the organization, and it would seem to me that he would be one of the people to consult with respect to the future of the organization. And if indeed he was told to be consulted and he wasn't consulted, I certainly don't blame him for seeking out other pasture.
And it's still that attitude of we know what's best. And I know in the NBA, just from personal experience, I know that was what ended Chris Paul's time in New Orleans. It was, as he gained more stature, he felt, and we all felt like he should be at least consulted when the organization was making, major moves, particularly like his favorite targets. Right? He had this thing with Tyson, he's throwing lobs, and then you don't literally tell him you're thinking about trading away the guy that he's sort of created this unique style of play with, really turned him the wrong way. And what the NBA has done, and what I witnessed as I went, over my last few years with different organizations, it was like, and even when Monty Williams and Dell Demps came into New Orleans, I was with them for 1 year. Dell was like, look, the fact that, you guys, and more mainly CP, wasn't consulted, he just couldn't understand why that was. And I remember him sitting down with us and saying, look, I'm not going to ask you guys to make the decision for me, but I do think it's important to get your input. And doing that was a way I felt like it connected the players who have the most vested in this, right? I often talk about the fact that it's the players that are the ones that don't have years to waste. A general manager can waste years, right? The team president can blow a couple years, but in terms of a player, you can't, because you can't get those years back. So it's important to include guys. So a guy of Deshaun Watson's caliber absolutely must be, again, he doesn't have to make the final decision, but he should definitely be involved in the process. And if a team can't see that in like 2021, then it kind of gives you an understanding of where their mindset still is, right? If they don't understand that you definitely need to include the players in these equations now, because they've got the power to say, well, okay, to hell with your franchise, I want to go somewhere else. And now the Houston, Texans, I don't believe that there's a caliber of quarterback in the draft of Deshaun Watson's caliber. Maybe Trevor Lawrence, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you 100%. You said something interesting, David, which is there are two pieces to it. One is just the disrespect of not being consulted.
Right.
And the fact that is also a poor business decision. Right. But two, the signal that it sends to him, which is that, okay, I have a sense that in moving forward, you have the inputs that you want, you know who you want to consult, and it's not the players. And so it makes me question your judgment, right, about any number of things, and so you just can't blame him. Very unfortunate, though, because it was exciting to see what was developing there just a few years ago.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely incredible talent. We'll see where he ends up. Obviously, hoping the best. To your point, Jeremy, seems to be a really good guy within the community as well, which is always good to see. More than a player just focusing on his playing career, focusing on the greater good. So I think I made the mistake of asking multiple questions at the same time. So just circling back to one last one that I had, which was, what exactly is the role that the Fritz Pollard Alliance continues to play within all of these iterations of the rule, and just the continued advocacy, not only of the rule, but also of individual candidates throughout the hiring cycles?
Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't get to that earlier, Rick. I'm glad you asked it again. So the Fritz Pollard Alliance remains very involved. It's Rod Graves is the executive director of the organization. Rod was the GM out there with Arizona when they went to the Super Bowl. He was high up with the Bears before that. He's a seasoned NFL executive, and he's got connections throughout the league. Extraordinary judgment. I like him a lot. He's a good guy. And so he's working hard on these issues. He works very closely with Commissioner Goodell and Troy Vincent and Jeff Pash up there in the NFL's office. So you can probably assume that when there's an issue, a development the league has, a new initiative, that Rod's been, consulted, been a part of the brain trust on it, and that the FPA therefore has, really does have a seat at the table. But the other piece you mentioned is the big one, which is, in addition to that, the FPA advocates for its members. It is a membership organization, the organization of coaches and scouts and executives of color in the league. So it advocates for its members, and it encourages kind of mentorship among its members. So for the more seasoned ones to help guide the more junior ones on, okay, here's what you do if you really want to get to the head coach level, the GM level. Here's how you approach interviews. Here's what you want to come prepared with. Here are the sort of questions that you're going to get, and so on and so forth. So it's really a multi-pronged organization. Does really good work. It's been an honor to be associated with.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some really, really good candidates. Obviously, Bieniemy, Leslie Frazier, Byron Leftwich, Todd Bowles. Hopefully we see some Jim Caldwell. We see some of those guys getting either another opportunity in the case of Bowles or Caldwell, or a first opportunity in the case of Leftwich or Bieniemy. I guess that'll be my last question is how do you have any sort of explanation for how Eric Bieniemy doesn't have a job at this point? Have a head coaching job, excuse me.
Right. And I was going to say, Ricky, to that, like, why hasn't one of these major colleges, come and try to swoop him up either? Because, I mean, they've done that in the past, right? When they've seen the top coordinator at the pro level, he's not getting an opportunity. Hey, come be our head coach. He hasn't had that opportunity either. So yeah, I'd love to hear that answer.
Yeah, no, I have no explanation. And I mean, Bieniemy is obviously the first person you think about, but you just mentioned a bunch of folks, almost the majority of whom are going to be playing next weekend, right? So you've got, Todd Bowles and Leftwich in Tampa. You've got Bieniemy in Kansas City, and there are plenty of coordinators who have taken their teams to the Super Bowl and gotten jobs. Some people say, well, they're still, playing. You can't interview them. No, but it's just harder for the candidates of color, it seems to be. Right. And, some of I'm not going to get into any particular hires, but to say that some of these hires were more inspired hires than a Bieniemy hire would be, or a Leftwich right now, with what's happened in that offense over the course of the season. Let's remember where they were initially. People thought it was a huge mistake. Tampa wasn't going to go anywhere, everybody said. You think that they got from there to here without Leftwich having a lot to say about it? So it's, it's hard to explain. It's impossible, as David said, to explain. And it's just deeply disappointing. Then you got folks like Leslie Frazier, what he did with the Buffalo defense, Caldwell, who went to the Super Bowl with Indianapolis, goes to Detroit, had success there. His successor failed there for many years, it's perplexing and mind-boggling and really upsetting, quite frankly, that these folks remain, held out of head coaching positions. I was hoping for more, Ricky and David, this hiring season. So it's been a disappointment.
All right. Well, to end it on a more positive note, I tend to ask our guests about their routines. For our young listeners, and you've had some success in your life, I just want to get a sense of what is it that you do every day to set your routine, to get you moving toward, making progress from day to day. Even maybe something you were doing in college that helped you get to where you are now. But how important is it to have, sort of a daily routine, whether it's in the morning, evening, afternoon, or how important has that been to your success?
That's been very important. It's been very important, I guess, kind of on a philosophical level, but also on a practical level. Philosophically, this may sound trite, but I spend a lot of time most days thinking about how fortunate I am, to be honest. And when I do that, it automatically improves my mood, makes me more eager to work because I'm fortunate that I get to work and I get to do the work that I'm doing. it just keeps me moving forward. Practically, I'll say, particularly for writers. I've done a lot of writing. I do a lot of writing. I think morning solitude is critical. I think morning solitude. I'm the first one up. I'm married. I've got 3 kids, 3 boys, 17, 14, and 7. So once everybody's up, it's kind of crazy, particularly when we're all working out of the house and schooling out of the house. But I get up early. I have time to myself, time to think. Sometimes I meditate. I like to stretch, and I start to get into my work before everything starts to bustle around me. And I found that to be critical as a general matter, but certainly in terms of my writing. To get a good hour and a half done, early in the day really sets me in the right direction.
Awesome. I appreciate that answer. It's been a great conversation. Appreciate your time. I enjoyed the conversation. It's been nice to meet you.
Good to see you again, Ricky. Great to meet you, David. Wish you all the best in this 2021, and hopefully sport will work for us in a positive way throughout the year.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to real quick, give our audience a plug. If you want to hear more, read more about this, you can also check out Jeremy's book, Advancing the Ball, Race Reformation, and the Quest for Equal Coaching Opportunity in the NFL. So, Jeremy, thanks again for your time.
Hey, you're most welcome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host, David West. With us today, we have another special guest, senior writer at ESPN and the Undefeated, as well as co-writer of I Came as a Shadow, an autobiography on Coach John Thompson, Jesse Washington. Jesse, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, man, appreciate you guys.
So we always like to tip it off by having our guests give us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I've always been interested in reading primarily and then writing. When I was in college, I started in the sports department of my local newspaper in Poughkeepsie, New York. This is in the mid 80s. And I enjoyed the gig. I quickly moved out of sports writing and moved into general news and did some hip hop magazines and things like that, and never returned to sports writing. I sort of like to say never did, because when they approached me to come to the Undefeated, I was covering race and ethnicity for the Associated Press. And I said, I like sports and everything, but there's more to life than sports. I wouldn't feel fulfilled if all I was writing about was wins and losses. And they were like, nah, you can do all that other stuff too. That's what the Undefeated is all about. So here I am.
Awesome. And how'd you come to end up being the co-writer with Big John on the book?
Wow. His kids convinced him to finally write the book, and they were looking for somebody. And the former president of ESPN, John Skipper, shout to the other Big John, somebody asked him if he knew a black writer who would be good, because I think it was a foregone conclusion that John Thompson was going to choose a black guy to write his book. And John Skipper put my name into the hat. So Coach invited me over to his house, where I met with him, his daughter Tiffany, and his son John. And they put me through the ringer a little bit and had some pointed questions. I remember them asking, why did you wear Adidas into my house? At this point, I don't think I really knew that Coach Thompson was on the board of directors at Nike. They asked me why I wore Adidas. Coach Thompson said, you've never written a book like this before. What makes you think you could write mine? But, I struggled my way through the interview, and he ended up choosing me to write the book.
And so what's that process like? How do you get yourself prepared to take on a task like John Thompson,
Man.
The legendary John Thompson?
Yeah, I wanted to be prepared, and I wanted to read as much as I could about him before showing up to work every day. I wanted to come with topics and games and instances and incidents for him to talk about. There was a biography of him written, I think in 1990, the early 90s, was before Allen Iverson got there. So I read that, and the book really made me angry because it reminded me of all the ways he had been mischaracterized, intimidating, a bully, aggressive, things like that. So that book made me angry and sort of got me revved up. I read a lot of newspaper articles. Coach Thompson had an academic advisor who really became second in command of his program. Her name was Mary Fenlon. And she kept scrapbooks of all of the coverage from when he got there in 1972 all the way to when he retired in 99. So I spent a lot of time reading those newspaper accounts of everything that happened before our interviews. And then we would sit down and Coach, I would ask Coach specific questions, but he had big picture themes that he wanted to deal with. He didn't really care about how I won this game or how I beat Houston, what strategies I used in the NCAA championship game. He wanted to talk about education and and rights for Black people and the misperceptions of him as a racist or a bully. So we had to figure out how to mesh those things together. But he appreciated the fact that I came prepared. And that's sort of when I knew, just because he hired me in the beginning to write the book didn't mean that I would finish it.
Right.
So once he said that he appreciated the work that I put in, I figured I was good.
So I remember when I was young, there used to be like this joke about, did they ask him about why he doesn't recruit white players? Were you able to cover that? I mean, how was that portion of sort of talking to him about that? Because I remember being a kid, how that was thrown at us by my childhood coach. And I'm just interested to hear.
Right. So your coach perpetuated the lie to you. So
that's
100%.
what I thought.
Yeah. I mean, that was I had people, just friends of mine, intelligent, dare I say liberal friends of mine. And, oh, what you working on, Jess? I'm writing Coach Thompson's autobiography. Oh, yeah, he wouldn't put any white guys on his team, right? He said he refused to recruit a white player. No. So we did get into that, definitely. And it happened a bit organically because as I'm reading these articles and going through the programs and the things from when he first got to Georgetown, I'm like, wait, he had plenty of white players. But they gradually started dwindling out because people were negatively recruiting against him. Because, as he says in his book, look, I'm a Black man. I lived in a predominantly Black city. We're playing a game where most of the players are Black. Of course, my team is going to be mostly Black.
Right.
Now, it did get to be all Black. And there were several specific instances. There's one part in the book that was heartbreaking. His high school coach, he loved this guy. His name was Jack Dwyer. I'm not sure Jack, but his name was Dwyer, Coach Dwyer from Archbishop Carroll High School. They had one of the best teams in Washington history, won 55 games in a row, one of the first integrated teams. This is 56 through 60. And come to find out later on, when they offered Coach Thompson the job at Georgetown, basically his high school coach thought that he should have got it. Like he wanted the job. They had offered it to Coach Thompson. He didn't know that. He said, yeah, it'd be good for so-and-so to get that. I'll get the job for a couple of years and then give it to this other guy over here. All the while, it had already been offered to Coach Thompson. But he let that go. But then while he was coaching at Georgetown, his high school coach told a white kid who he was recruiting, he doesn't really want you on the team. He just wants you there as a white token. And that devastated Coach Thompson because it was false. He really wanted this kid as a player. Right. And that was gutting to him. And he never spoke to that man again. Ever.
Oh.
Ever. And they had a reunion for their undefeated high school teams, and Coach Thompson refused to go. And his high school coach tried to apologize to him, and he never replied. And then he said in his book, that's one of the things I hope Jesus forgives me for. But that's how painful it was to him. Then there was another one reported where the coach of James Madison University told another kid they were recruiting, Jeff Bullis, who's on Twitter. You could find him and ask him on Twitter. He told this kid, Jeff Bullis, he's only recruiting you as a token. He doesn't really want any white kids. But everyone says he's a racist, so he figures he's going to get a couple white kids to ride the bench, which was a lie. Which was a lie. And Jeff Bullis went to Georgetown and played good minutes. So long story short, he was fine with white players, but he got this false reputation as a racist. So would you send your kid if you were a white parent, would you send your kid there?
Right.
He said, I never would have sent my kid to play in Jim Crow, Mississippi. To white parents, I was Mississippi. So, but it's amazing, David, that this stereotype this lie was so pervasive that it even got to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard that. We heard that as kids. Like as a kid, that was like something that we're like, word? You're like, yeah, that's why his team. And like it was, our coaches felt a certain kind of way about it, but
they felt a very certain kind of way.
Yeah.
Did they say that's why they can't shoot? Some nonsense with that. Because when they won it all, they had two black guys. They had Gene Smith and Fred Brown in the backcourt, and neither of those guys were offensively minded. They had plenty of firepower elsewhere. And Coach Thompson noted that they led the nation in field goal percentage, quote unquote, with two guys who can't shoot. He said, we took the ball and got layups.
Yeah, I mean, coming from, not too far from DC and growing up in that area, I mean, there's still people to this day that think that Georgetown's an HBCU.
Right.
as a result of the players that they saw playing for that team growing up, which obviously is not the case. But so going back though to, you talked about Coach Thompson had these themes that he wanted to include. We've had a couple people on before that have written books, but like, how do you actually structure all that together and, kind of weave through obviously accomplishing what you need to accomplish as far as the publisher is concerned, but then being true to the story and making sure that Coach Thompson is confident in what you're doing?
That was a challenge, and we had to figure it out. The publisher really stayed out of the way, and he trusted us. And if he had not, then Coach Thompson probably would have took his ball and went home and been like, forget y'all, I'll go do my book somewhere else. So we figured out that it would be best to do it in a chronological fashion, but we had to get the themes in there. So what we looked for was episodes in his life that illustrated the theme. And so Black intelligence was a major theme, something that Coach Thompson wanted to deal with. And the title of the book, I Came as a Shadow, actually comes from the importance that intelligence had to him, because he had an uncle who was a poet in the Harlem Renaissance. And when he grew up in the 40s and 50s in DC, the only examples of Black excellence that he saw visible to him were athletes. Joe Louis, Elgin Baylor, other baseball players, things like that. There were no Black guys in the NBA. They had good Black college teams. But he had an uncle who was a poet, and people praised his uncle for his intelligence. And he was like, oh, this is the first Black man I've ever seen who people talk about being smart. And then the poem that he wrote, I Came as a Shadow, as Coach Thompson got older and read it, he identified with the shadow. He's like, I am that shadow that showed up and scared everybody, but I stand now a light, So we would find examples when intelligence was something that played a pivotal role in an event or in a game, or when he was underestimated, or when his players were called stupid. That was a persistent lie that was told about Georgetown's players throughout. And what they predicated it on was, they let him in with lower scores than everybody else. Like Georgetown is the first school to ever do that. That's how sports works. But they didn't like it when a Black coach was doing it at a quote unquote elite school like Georgetown. Oh, it's fine to do it at University of Georgia or LSU, but not at Georgetown. Harvard does it. Yale does it, but it was perceived differently when it was Coach Thompson. So we would find instances like that and layer that in. And then, we would let him tell his stories, but always come back to the point. There was a time when he was talking about a 6th grade teacher that he had named Sametta Wallace Jackson. And Coach Thompson, believe it or not, one of the most intelligent people in American public life that we've ever seen, in the 6th grade could not read. He was expelled from his previous school because he had a disability and needed a reading specialist to learn how to read. Sametta Wallace Jackson is the one who identified and corrected his problem. And while she did that, she protected him. And her protection of him is something that he took to Georgetown. So all that stuff about not letting reporters in practice and Hoya paranoia was him protecting his players. And so he says in his book, she taught me how to read. She saved my life. She affected my coaching more than some of these great coaches that I learned from. And we'll go down that route in the book, but then we'll bring it back to the moment that he's in and continue to tell the story. So that's sort of how we did the structure.
In terms of the importance of education, because obviously that's a critical theme within the book. I know there's the deflating basketball story that you hear often about him. What were the other elements? Because again, people associate some of the top, you got Ewing, you got Iverson, you have some of these elite players that played for him, but sometimes that educational importance to Coach Thompson got overlooked.
It did, especially early in his career, because he got there in 72. By the end of the 70s, they got really good. They just missed the Final Four in 79, I think, or maybe 80. Then Patrick got there in 80 and they went to the championship game. And so at that point, people didn't really get him. They felt he was just the big, Black, scary, angry coach with the team of quote unquote thugs. As time went on, his reputation started getting out there. And so the themes that he wanted to talk about was that, he emphasized over and over, I never wanted to be a coach. I always intended to be a teacher. His mom was a teacher. Sametta Wallace-Jackson. He had many teachers that he really admired, most of them Black women. He had counselors who at the boys club, number 2 that he belonged to in Washington, D.C., that were very influential for him. So he wanted to do that. He wanted to be a teacher, a youth counselor. And when he left the Boston Celtics, and mind you, he won 2 rings with the Celtics in the Red Auerbach dynasty. He backed up Bill Russell. He's like, all right, I'm done with basketball. I'm going to go teach. I'm going to be a counselor. And he did. So he really emphasizes in the book that how much he considered himself a teacher. And this man would blow the whistle in practice. And Michael Jackson, his championship point guard, told me he might cuss me out for messing up a defense, or he might blow the whistle and ask, okay, y'all dumb motherfuckers, what happened in Iran today? Like, who asked that in practice? He said he would sit everybody down and have a speech about economics or something like this, like always teaching. There's some great anecdotes in the book about, and I don't want to, spoil it for everybody, but just about the things he would do in practice that had nothing to do with basketball. But he had a higher mission, Right. It was nothing for him to take an hour out of practice to sit down and talk to the team about life. Or economics, or he brought his Nike contract down. He had this whole lesson, and he tells a story great in the book, had this whole lesson. He told them, bring my Nike contract down there, pass it around, let everybody see how much money he was making. He said, but check this out. I wear dress shoes to the game. Y'all are the ones wearing the sneakers, and I'm the one getting paid. And the conclusion to his anecdote was that he said to his team, now, why have none of y'all dumb motherfuckers asked me for some of this money?
Wow.
Like, and this is in the early 80s.
Right.
I mean, so that's what he was into in his book.
Right. What about what did you learn about his style? Just his communication style, his coaching style. And maybe, without giving too much, but I've always been curious about the way a coach like that. He's hard, and I mean, I experienced him while he was retired, but he like when he was doing, I think he was calling games. He called a couple of my games while I was coming through.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard some stuff about him, but I've always been sort of curious thing of mine of how a coach who has sort of this reputation, he's tough, his communication and the way he interacts with his guys is a bit different. But what did you learn about, sort of the way he communicated and building and those things?
I love that question. If you look at the photos in the book of when he's coaching, he's very often, when he's talking to a player, he has a hand on their shoulder. He has an arm around their waist. He was in physical contact with them a lot, which to me was a subliminal message of love. Right. And he needed that because he would cuss them out relentlessly. I mean, relentlessly. He was very hard. He says, I went too far sometimes. But he also says, I'd never cursed out anybody who didn't know that I loved them.
Right.
And he also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's just making me think of my teammate. Roy said he was messing up in practice one day. And he said, you're either going to be an NBA center or you're going to be the biggest postal delivery guy.
Yo.
But it worked for Roy because Roy said, nah, I ain't going to be no postal delivery. I'm too big to be doing that,
Yo, and he was so funny. He was so funny. A lot of stuff he would say. Also, his style included, so it was very multifaceted. Like, this man is so deep. So very multifaceted. So you got the profanity, you got the physical contact and the love. You have they said it was nothing for him to sit down, be running cats in practice and sit down with a sandwich and be eating a sandwich in practice while they're running. And they said they knew that they were not going to get to stop running until the sandwich was finished.
Wow.
Another thing, he said sometimes he'd blow the whistle and they pressed and fast broke the whole game. So they had to be in great shape. Sometimes he said he didn't have to even tell him to run. He said he would just take his finger and swipe it from left to the right. And everybody knew that meant to line up. Another thing so then you got that. Then you got the Black History Month lectures, or the Black History Month is every month lectures. You got those. Another thing that he said to me was that Dean Smith, the great North Carolina coach, was one of his greatest mentors in life. Him and Red Auerbach. which is an amazing thing to think about. The two coaches that influenced the most this black icon were two white coaches.
Right.
He said that one night he called up Dean Smith, and him and Dean Smith would talk on the phone until late at night. And he was having some problems with his team, and he was telling him, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. And Dean said, "You'll be all right." And Coach Thompson was like, "I'll be all right. What are you talking about? Like, what do you mean I'll be all right?" He said, "Well, you're blaming yourself. As long as you're not blaming the kids, you'll be all right." And Coach Thompson said, when you blame yourself, you keep searching for the answer.
Right.
You know? So he would always keep searching for the answer and keep searching for a way to try to motivate them. The last thing I want to say about his coaching style was that he always wanted to keep them off balance and be very unpredictable. And, you know, and he said, I wanted them to think I was capable of anything. So for one thing, he knew everything that was happening in the city. So Dikembe told me that and this didn't make it into the book. Dikembe said one night I went off campus and went to the club. And when I got to the club, the doorman said, "Coach called and said, get your ass home." How does he know where he's going? How does he have the number to call the guy in the 90s before?
Right.
But he was always surprising people and doing crazy stuff in practice. Another Dikembe story was Dikembe missed class to go to the dentist because he had a dental emergency. When he got to the gym, Coach Thompson ran up on him, went nuts, told him to get to his locker, and there was a plane ticket in his locker going back to Zaire. And the flight left that night. And he said, if you're not going to go to class, you could go fight in Mobutu's army.
Wow.
Now, you know, and so these are the type of things he would do. There's another anecdote about when an alcoholic beverage that he may or may not have put into his players' water bottles when they were drinking too much, you know. So this is his style. He's going to be on you hard. He's going to love you. He's going to let you know that he loves you. He's going to surprise you. He's going to be 2 steps ahead of you at all time, and he's going to do things that are very unpredictable. And you may spend the majority of practice talking about world affairs. I mean, is there another coach in history that we could point to, along with having Hall of Famers, you know?
Right.
Like, that's part of what makes him so special.
Juxtaposing a current issue with, I know something that you've told me before, he evolved in his thinking on was the fight for player empowerment and compensation of college athletes. Take us through sort of that evolution of his thinking and where he ended up by the end.
Absolutely. He evolved while we were writing the book. I was very interested to know how he felt about that. And very near the beginning of the process, it took us 2 years to write the book. We started 2 years before his death. And I would ask him what he thought about it, and he had reservations. He didn't say no, but he was like, I really don't know how it would work. And he would raise all of the typical objections that people do. And he would say, yeah, you know, they probably deserve some of the money, but I'm worried about this. I'm worried about the educational aspect of that. If I'm essentially hiring the player, can I fire them also? So on and so forth. But then events started happening, and Coach was deeply affected by the non-punishment of all of these coaches who were paying players. He also was deeply affected by the firing of his son at Georgetown, where his son is losing players to schools that pay for them, you know? And he said, hey, yeah, he said in the rare occasions when they catch a coach for breaking the rules, they like to vacate his wins, right? And they take your banners down and they say you didn't really win those games. And then he paused and he said, but they don't vacate the losses. When I lose to a coach that cheated, they don't take that loss off my record, you know? So he put all these things together and he said, look, they're paying everybody at the top level of basketball. They're paying the kids anyway. The whole system is filthy with it. That's a direct quote. The NCAA is refusing to enforce their own rules. And there's a moral aspect to it where these kids do deserve to share in some of the money that they are generating. He said, don't act like the education is not worth anything, but they should receive more in addition to the value of education. And so towards the end of his life, He came out, he called me up one day hot. He watched that movie, The Scheme,
Mm-hmm.
and he called me up hot. And that's when he changed his mind. And Coach Thompson, to my knowledge, is the only prominent coach, big-time championship coach in any sport to say college athletes deserve to share in the revenue they generate. But he was always ahead of his time in so many ways. So that was just one of the final ways in his lifetime that he was ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. So you said it took 2 years to get through that process.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Coach Thompson passed away at the very end of it. I'm pretty sure you've already said this publicly before, but by the end, every word was his. Correct?
It was. He really cared a whole lot about getting it right. I mean, he said over and over, Jesse, we have to get this right, because I don't think he, without getting into all the details about his thoughts about his own mortality, but he knew that this book would stand forever as his statement, his statement of purpose and being, and him defining himself. So when COVID hit in March, Coach passed away at the end of August, and COVID hit in March, so we couldn't meet in person anymore. And he was always very respectful of my time, and didn't, blow up my phone or call me late at night. But I could tell he was feeling a little nervous about finishing the book. So one day I said, Coach, whatever you need, you can call me whenever you want. We can stay on the phone all night. If that's what we need to do to finish the book, I got you. And he said, you're going to regret that. And from then on, he took it to another level. And we would be 2 and 3 hours a night on the phone, working on the book, me reading sections to him. I never regretted a minute of it. This is John Thompson. So, right. I felt a responsibility, and, this is a totally unique and extraordinarily valuable piece of Black history. And so for him to ask me to relate that and to set that down, there was no amount of work that would have been too much to do that correctly. So over those last months, we spent hours and hours on the phone reading through it. And that's why he asked me to do the audiobook, because I read it so much. And as I was reading it, I was feeling emotional, I was, and he said, oh yeah, Jesse, I want you to read the book because you understand the emotion behind it. And about, several weeks before his death, he said, so I guess we're done, huh? And he was a little bit disappointed, I think. And I said, yeah, Coach, I think we are. And I said, and excuse my language, but I said, that's not bad for 2 niggas from the projects, huh? And he said, yeah, put that in the book somewhere.
Yeah. Now, shifting away from the book a little bit, again, yep. we mentioned you're a senior writer at ESPN's Undefeated.
Mm-hmm.
So the Undefeated is obviously a very different vertical within ESPN. And in fact, it at times seems to be so staunchly different from anything else ESPN's doing. You mentioned how you got the opportunity to come and do that, but what has it meant to you to have the opportunity to, as opposed to covering wins and losses, getting the opportunity to tell stories within that intersection of sport, culture, race?
Man, I feel so fortunate to have landed here by the grace of God at this particular time, with everything that's going on in sports, with how much is needed, how much advocacy and movement and justice is needed in sports. To really have this opportunity and this platform, I think is tremendous. And there is literally no other place I would rather be working than the Undefeated right now, because we can deal with all the issues that are beyond sports. And, ESPN has been sort of shook in these last few years with what happened politically speaking, and cord cutting is going on, and then conservatives are coming after them, and Jamel is shaking things up. And so ESPN can be kind of conservative politically, but I've written some pretty edgy things, and they have never stepped in to say, no, you can't write that. And that has happened to me in my career at other places. And there was one piece that I wrote that I was sure that they were going to spike, and I probably wouldn't have blamed them. It was when Daryl Morey sent his tweet about China, and then LeBron James, whose activism and advocacy I greatly respect, took the easy way out, in my opinion. I wrote a very critical column, and ESPN does big business over there. And Disney's trying to open Disneyland over there. And I was like, nah, they ain't running this, but I got to do me. I got to write it. And to their credit, the whole thing ran and we still got Disneyland. So, so, I'm very proud of the work that we're doing, and my colleagues are tremendously talented, and it's sports, but more than sports, beyond sports. We're about to launch a Black History Always initiative, which says that we might just have to retire Black History Month. And because it is American history, let's deal with it as necessary the whole year round. So shout out to Kevin Merida for really coming in and saving the day and elevating this to a platform. Our 5-year anniversary is coming up, and we're producing more shows now, documentaries, in addition to all of the journalism we do. I feel very grateful to have landed here, and serendipitously.
And so, speaking of the current climate that we're in right now, so we, as I mentioned, the first half of this episode we touched up with Jeremi Duru on this most recent hiring cycle within the NFL. Obviously, we have the Deshaun Watson situation now playing out minute by minute. What's your take on the current state of things within the NFL, and in particular with regards to equitable representation at that coaching and front office level?
I'm really disgusted, and I'm disgusted by the clear inequities that still remain in coaching at the coaching level, let alone at the ownership level, at the revenue level. I did see something come across recently that said the players' union is going to be discussing equity in the next bargaining round. Overall, despite some of these discouragements and discouraging things that I've seen, I feel like we are like maybe, and this could be wishful thinking, but like the dam is getting ready to burst. And I see small signs everywhere of empowerment, of athlete empowerment, of Black empowerment in this sports, this exploitative sports ecosystem that we live in. I've seen a lot of things in college sports recently that have really indicated that the athletes are recognizing their leverage. I mean, you had the football players down at Texas who said, until y'all clean up some of this racist songs and imagery, we're not participating in recruiting activities, and it worked. And this is the University of Texas we're talking about. The football player down in Mississippi, Ole Miss, I think, was like, man, get that flag out of here or I'm not playing. I think that the movement to properly compensate athletes is really gaining a lot of momentum. And the coaching stuff is more problematic because you're dealing with the decisions of the plutocracy, right? And Coach Thompson notes in his book that Black college basketball coaches have less influence now than they did when he was out there with John Chaney and George Raveling and Nolan Richardson. So there's been a step back there. There's a step back at the coaching, but at the NFL level. So I am, though, cautiously optimistic. And I think there's been such an outcry over this recent round of discriminatory hiring that the pressure is continuing to ramp up. The NFL players sort of brought Goodell to heel a little bit during the pandemic when George Floyd died. This man did say the words Black Lives Matter, which I'm sure really aggravated a lot of his owners. So I'm hopeful. I don't know. What about you guys? I mean, what do you think? Are you hopeful? Are you D West? I feel like you're gonna tell me all the reasons why things aren't changing.
I get what's some of what you're saying, just to the degree that I think we've got to a point, particularly with I brought it up yesterday in the conversation we were having, that even a league like the WNBA that is seen as the most progressive of all the leagues, I think they've got like 3 or 4 Black head coaches, and they just hired their first Black female head coach a few months ago. And then obviously the NBA's got I think 5 or fewer now. The NFL, just I don't expect anything different from the NFL, and I think we're getting ourselves worked up, over this idea that we are expecting these people to somehow change or behave differently, and I think we've got to keep, we're going to keep producing, top level people. We know that there are more than enough qualified men out there and women out there to be head coaches that just don't get opportunities. But there's some other other layers to this thing that we don't often talk about. And And I think it's hard, like you said, when you're dealing with society that doesn't sort of back up your power. So, in what's rare in the case of Coach Thompson is that, I think if you think about the successful Black coaches that we've had, the majority of the all-time greats were in the HBC environment, right? You talk about like the great coaches, and part of the reason is that sort of their power was reinforced in a way with what the environment of their university looked like, or that community that the school was in. And so I think we're dealing with that now, and we just deal with, obviously the stigma, the intelligence stigma, right? That you were talking about with Coach Thompson. It's like, is a Black coach, does he have the intelligence, the wit, the X's and O's, the ability to articulate himself and, organize not only himself, his life, but, young athletes or grown men in the case of the NFL or the NBA, be able to come up with plans strategically to help, people and the organization or the university. I think all of those things come into question when it comes to a Black coach. And one of my favorite quotes of Coach Thompson was, he was, I don't know where he was when he was speaking, and he was basically saying that it's not about hiring another John Thompson or hiring, I think at the time he mentioned Tubby Smith, both of whom had won like national championships. So he's like, it's about hiring the guy who can just be okay, be 500 for 15 years, right? A Black coach. And that's the essence of this thing, right? So it's the opportunity to fail, the opportunity to not, be a superstar, right? It's like the only Black coaches that get hired are the guys that have proven that they could win and be the very best of the best, as opposed to, there are a couple coaches I laugh because I still kind of peek into college basketball, but there are guys who have jobs for 15, 20 years, and these guys are 100 games under 500.
Thank you.
Don't have,
yes.
So that's what it really comes down to.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of his killer quotes in his book is, he quotes Gandhi, and he says, Gandhi said that freedom is the right to not be successful.
Right.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
I mean, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. Thanks for that.
Yeah. And I'll just add, I think, and this is something I've been doing a lot of lately, and ruffling some feathers with people, even in the pro athlete movement space in college sports, is holding up the mirror and looking at why we do what we do and why we're trying to bring about change. Because, for example, actually, we had her on as a guest, but so like Brittany Collins, whose wins were vacated at UMass, and there's been some movement now in her home state of Massachusetts, and things along those lines in terms of legislation. But my question to a lot of people is, well, obviously what happened to her is terrible, and the NCAA is showing their true colors yet again. But why did it take a white tennis player getting screwed over for the legislature in the state of Massachusetts to come forward and do something? Like, the exploitation of college athletes didn't begin when her wins were vacated. So what's so different about this situation? So it can't just be about change. It also has to be about the purpose behind the change, because in my opinion, that's how we have long-standing opportunities developed for these athletes, where we're viewing them as full-fledged citizens and not just athletes that we're giving an opportunity to, like they earned this.
Right.
So that's where I come at it.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I mean, I think it's well documented, but bears repeating, that for a lot of people look at the Black athletes in the revenue producing sports, and they think they should be grateful to be there. They think they're ahead of the game, that if they weren't there, they'd be out on the corner somewhere, and they begrudge them what they have. And they're mad that they got into these universities because they want their kids to get in, but their kids can't get into these universities. And so, there's a huge racial component to the need or the views on NCAA reform.
Right. I always make the comparison to The Dark Knight just because that's my favorite movie, so I like to think about it. But when the Joker's talking about, well, if you blow up a truck full of soldiers, nobody blinks an eye. But if you try to blow up a mayor, then everybody loses their minds. Like, to put that into this context, when we're screwing over the Black athletes, that's the plan. That's part of the plan.
That's the plan. The system doing what it was designed to do.
Right, but one group of tennis players gets screwed over, and now everybody
Right.
loses their minds.
Right.
Which
Don't let it happen to a girl with a ponytail, and then it's all hands on deck.
right. So I mean, again, I'm in full support of what Brittany's doing, and I'm glad to see that she's using her platform to elevate the struggle of college athletes. But if I was in a room with that Massachusetts legislature that's like, okay, this is the instance in which we have to introduce legislation now. Why was it this?
But you know what? And you're 100% right. And then at the same time, sometimes it's like, all right, but we're going to get it how we can get it. And it makes me think about this past summer and all of these corporations and universities and every organization you could think of getting all sensitive to the plight of of Black folks all of a sudden, and issuing these statements and having these initiatives. And you're like, man, did it really take for, some murder porn on the internet for you to, you should have been doing that all along. And so for me, I felt a certain sense of resentment that oh, now you want to care? But then at the same time, they should care and need to care. And so, yes, it was too late, but it was, so I had a lot of, very, what you're talking about with the young tennis player, I feel some of the same ways. I'm angry that that's what it took, but if that's what it takes, then let's get it.
Yeah. Yeah. My fear is always then in that situation that the change is only in the short term and not in the long term, because it's reactionary. We'll make that statement. We'll say the right thing so that people get off our backs. But then once things settle back down, it goes back to the status quo. So that's always my cynical fear is
got to stay vigilant.
Yeah. So my last question, man, it's just about routine. So you've experienced a certain level of success in your life. What can you share with some of our younger listeners just about the importance of a routine, whether it's your morning routine, you're getting ready to write routine, but what can you share about just, what you do to sort of get yourself focused from day to day, to steadily achieve and reach, some goals that you set for yourself?
Thank you. I love that, because it reminds me, I guess the first thing is that I know I'm not perfect. And so that if I miss my routine one day, that get back on it, man. That's what it is. And then I just think it's important to have a spiritual component to my routine. That's been very successful for me, to set aside time, particularly in the morning, instead of picking up your phone and getting into your phone off the gate, to find some time to get in touch with your creator. And whatever type of relationship you have with God, or the essence or force or yourself, whatever you want to call that, I find it very useful to begin with that. We have so much of a sensory overload, and our world is so fast paced that to deliberately slow that down in the morning, I find very useful. And then I also do that before I sit down to write. Then I try to have that same type of spiritual communion, focus, thought, because it's hard to get all this stuff out. There's a billion things coming into our head every day. And to a certain extent, success in our endeavors, you need to remove those distractions. And I think that everybody has some sort of relationship with a force, whether you want to call it God or this force that's beyond ourselves or our comprehension. We know it's out there somewhere. I really try to reach from that. That is my routine. That and trying to get some shots up in the pandemic. Those two things are my ingredients for success.
That must be tough in the climate that you're in, because I'm very familiar with it. That must be tough.
It is, but I'm a believer in if you can shoot with gloves on, then you can shoot much better when the gloves is off. And so I'm not above that. Our local YMCA has been open, although they prohibit any sort of one-on-one or anything else beyond that, under threat of expulsion, which I have come close to a couple times. But this, if you talk about routine, this pandemic has been a challenge to all of our health routines, and you have to find other ways and to adapt to what we don't have or what we take for granted in a lot of ways. So, it's been a horrific experience, but hopefully we can come out of it with a few new tools in our box.
Absolutely. Well, look, Jesse, we appreciate the time. It was a great conversation, man. Really learned a lot. And I'm going to go pick up the book. I really look forward to reading it. I'll shoot you a text, man, let you know what I think.
Thank you so much, man. Appreciate you guys. Appreciate all that you do.
Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League, featuring Jeremi Duru and Jesse Washington. Forward Thinking is co-hosted by David West and Ricky Vellante, produced by Wendell Haskins, Rafa Hernandez Brito, and Ricky Vellante, and the music is done by David West. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe Forward Thinking on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. Hope everybody is staying safe. We'll see y'all next week.